Sometimes the people who taught you independence are the same ones who expect you to rescue them when their own choices catch up. My name is Jessica Martinez, and this is the story of how I learned that saying no to family doesn't make you heartless. It makes you honest. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I'm 29 years old, living in downtown Denver, where the mountain views remind me daily that I climbed my own peaks to get here. As a senior software engineer at a growing tech startup, I spend my days solving complex problems and building systems that actually work. My apartment is small but modern, with floor-to-ceiling windows that flood the space with Colorado sunshine, and a desk where I've spent countless evenings working on side projects that might one day change my life completely. But let me take you back to where this all started, because understanding my story means understanding the foundation that was never built for me. I grew up in Scottsdale, Arizona, in a neighborhood where appearances mattered more than authenticity. My parents, Robert and Linda Martinez, weren't wealthy, but they weren't struggling either. Dad worked as an insurance executive, climbing the corporate ladder with the kind of determination that impressed his colleagues and exhausted his family. Mom sold real estate in the booming Phoenix market, riding the waves of Arizona's endless growth and development. Our house was the kind of place that looked perfect from the outside. Manicured desert landscaping, two-car garage, swimming pool that sparkled under the relentless Arizona sun. Inside, though, there was always this underlying tension about money, about who deserved what, about fairness that wasn't actually fair at all. My younger brother Tyler was 4 years behind me, and from the moment he could walk, it seemed like the world bent around him in ways it never did for me. When I was in high school, working part-time at a local coffee shop to save money for college applications, Tyler was getting a brand new truck for his 16th birthday. When I was researching scholarships and staying up late filling out financial aid forms, Tyler was getting private tutoring because his grades weren't quite where they needed to be for sports eligibility. The message was always clear, even when nobody said it out loud. Tyler needed help, and Jessica could handle things herself. I remember the exact conversation that set the tone for everything that followed. It was spring of my senior year, and I had been accepted to the University of Colorado Boulder for computer science. I was sitting at our kitchen table, surrounded by acceptance letters and financial aid documents, trying to make sense of the numbers that would determine my future. The in-state tuition was manageable, but the out-of-state costs for Colorado were substantial. I had worked hard for this acceptance, spent years building the GPA and extracurricular activities that would get me into a good program. Dad walked in from work, loosening his tie and grabbing a beer from the refrigerator. I looked up from my calculator and spreadsheets, feeling hopeful and nervous at the same time. Mom was chopping vegetables for dinner, humming softly to herself, and Tyler was sprawled on the living room couch playing video games with the volume turned up just loud enough to be annoying. "Dad, can we talk about college?" I asked, gesturing to the papers spread across the table. "I got into Boulder, and I think with some help, I can make the finances work." He paused, beer halfway to his lips, and something shifted in his expression. Not surprise exactly, but something like resignation. Mom stopped humming and turned around, crossing her arms over her chest in that way that meant she had already made up her mind about something. "Jessica, honey, you know we're proud of you," Mom started, using the tone she reserved for difficult conversations. "But college is a big investment, and we think you need to understand the value of working for what you want." I felt my stomach drop, but I pressed on. "I am working for it. I've been saving for 2 years, and I applied for every scholarship I could find. I just need some help with the gap." Dad sat down across from me, avoiding eye contact with the financial aid forms. "Look, sweetheart, Tyler's going to need support too when his time comes. We can't afford to pay for both of you, and we want to be fair." Fair. That word would echo in my head for years to come, because what they called fair was actually the opposite. What they meant was that they wanted to save their money for Tyler, who had never shown any interest in academic achievement, who assumed everything would be handed to him because it always had been. "Tyler's still in 8th grade," I pointed out, trying to keep my voice steady. "That's 4 years away, and I'm not asking you to pay for everything. Just help me cover what I can't manage alone." Mom dried her hands on a dish towel and came over to the table, but she didn't sit down. Instead, she stood behind Dad's chair, presenting a united front. "Jessica, you're smart and capable. You'll figure it out. Tyler is going to need more guidance, more support. You've always been independent." Independent. Another word that sounded like a compliment, but felt like abandonment. I was independent because I had learned early that no one else was going to advocate for me. I was independent because every time I asked for help, I was reminded that someone else needed it more. "What if I go to Arizona State instead?" I suggested, grasping for compromise. "The in-state tuition is much lower, and I could live at home to save money." Dad shook his head. "You're 18, Jessica. It's time to start making your own way. We raised you to be strong and self-sufficient, and now it's time to prove it." I looked around the kitchen that I had helped maintain, thought about the years I had spent babysitting Tyler while they worked late, remembered all the times I had been the responsible one while my brother coasted by on charm and excuses. The unfairness of it all sat heavy in my chest, but I was 18 and naive enough to think that if I just worked hard enough, everything would turn out fine. That night, I called my guidance counselor and asked about student loans. I researched work-study programs and part-time job opportunities near the Boulder campus. I made spreadsheets calculating exactly how much I would need to borrow and how long it would take to pay back. The number was daunting. By the time I graduated, I would owe close to $85,000, but I convinced myself it was an investment in my future. The summer before college was a blur of work and preparation. I picked up extra shifts at the coffee shop and took a second job cleaning offices in the evenings. While Tyler spent his summer vacation playing video games and hanging out with friends, I was saving every penny I could for textbooks and living expenses. Mom and Dad seemed relieved that I had stopped asking for help, praising my work ethic, while simultaneously planning a family vacation to California that cost more than a semester of college tuition. When they dropped me off at the University of Colorado Boulder that August, there was something almost ceremonial about it. They helped me move into my dorm room, took pictures by the campus sign, and hugged me goodbye with what felt like genuine pride. But as I watched their car disappear down the campus drive, I felt profoundly alone in a way that had nothing to do with being away from home for the first time. College was everything I had hoped it would be, and everything I had feared it might cost me. The computer science program was rigorous and challenging, pushing me to think in ways I never had before. I loved the logic of coding, the satisfaction of solving complex problems, the community of other students who shared my passion for technology. But underneath the excitement of learning and growing was the constant stress of money. While my roommates went out for dinner and movies, I was working in the campus computer lab, earning $12 an hour helping other students with their programming assignments. While they joined study groups at coffee shops, I was picking up shifts at the campus bookstore during peak textbook season. While they went home for long weekends, I stayed on campus because I couldn't afford the flight to Phoenix and couldn't afford to miss work. I called home every Sunday because that's what good daughters do, and because some part of me kept hoping that my parents would ask how I was managing financially, would offer to help with just a little bit of the burden I was carrying. Instead, the conversations were always about Tyler's latest achievements or struggles, about Dad's work stress, about Mom's latest real estate client drama. "How's school going?" Mom would ask, and I would tell her about my classes and my grades, about the projects I was working on and the professors who were mentoring me. But when I mentioned being tired from working so many hours or stressed about making rent, there would be this awkward pause, and then she would change the subject to something safer. Tyler, meanwhile, was thriving in high school in ways that I never had. He made varsity soccer as a sophomore, and suddenly my parents were traveling to away games and buying team gear and talking about college recruitment. The same parents who had told me that college was too expensive were now discussing private soccer camps and showcase tournaments that cost thousands of dollars. During my sophomore year, I came home for Thanksgiving break, my first visit home, in months because I had been working through previous holidays to make extra money. The house looked exactly the same, but everything felt different. Tyler had grown taller and more confident, filling the space in ways that made me feel like a visitor in my childhood home. We were sitting around the dinner table, and Dad was telling stories about Tyler's soccer season, about college scouts who had been asking questions, and coaches who were interested in recruiting him. Mom was beaming with pride, passing around her phone to show off action shots from recent games. "We're thinking about hiring a recruiting consultant," Dad mentioned casually, cutting into his turkey. "Someone who can help Tyler navigate the college application process, maybe get some scholarship opportunities." I nearly choked on my cranberry sauce. "A recruiting consultant? They're expensive, but they know how to position athletes for the best opportunities," Mom explained. "Tyler has real potential for college soccer, maybe even some scholarship money." I set down my fork, trying to process what I was hearing. "How much does something like that cost?" "Around $15,000 for the full package," Dad said, as if he was discussing the price of a new refrigerator. "But it's an investment in Tyler's future." $15,000. More than I made in a year working part-time on campus. More than half of what I owed in student loans for a single semester. I sat there listening to them plan this investment in Tyler's future while I was eating Thanksgiving dinner with a knot in my stomach, knowing that I would have to pick up extra shifts over winter break just to afford textbooks for spring semester. "That sounds great," I managed to say, because what else was there to say? I was the daughter who could handle things herself, the one who didn't need help, the one who had chosen the expensive path and therefore had to live with the consequences. After dinner, I was washing dishes while Tyler played video games, and Mom came into the kitchen to dry and put things away. For a moment, it felt like old times, the two of us working together in comfortable companionship. "You know, Jessica, we're really proud of how well you're doing in school," she said, folding the dish towel neatly. "Your grades are excellent, and you seem to be learning so much." "Thanks, Mom. I love what I'm studying, even though it's challenging." She paused, seeming to choose her words carefully. "Are you managing okay? Financially, I mean?" For a split second, I thought she was offering to help, that maybe she had noticed how thin I looked, how tired I seemed, how carefully I had to budget even for things like shampoo and laundry detergent. I thought maybe this was the moment when she would acknowledge the disparity in how she and Dad treated their children. "It's tough sometimes," I admitted. "I'm working a lot of hours just to cover basics, and the loan payments are going to be pretty overwhelming when I graduate." Mom nodded sympathetically, but then she said something that stopped me cold. "Well, you're building character, and you'll appreciate your education more because you worked so hard for it. Tyler is going to need more guidance through the process." Character. I was building character by eating ramen noodles for dinner and working 40 hours a week while taking a full course load. Tyler was getting $15,000 in professional guidance because he needed more support. The difference was stunning in its clarity, and for the first time, I felt something shift inside me, a small crack in the foundation of acceptance I had built around my family's choices. I finished my degree in 4 years, graduating with honors, and a job offer from a tech startup in Denver. The graduation ceremony was surreal. My parents flew up for the weekend, took pictures, and celebrated my achievement with genuine enthusiasm. They seemed proud of what I had accomplished, but there was no acknowledgement of what it had cost me. No recognition of the sacrifice they had asked me to make while planning Tyler's easier path. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. Moving to Denver felt like stepping into a new life. My starting salary was good enough to cover my student loan payments and still have something left over for a decent apartment and occasionally going out with coworkers. For the first time since high school, I wasn't constantly calculating whether I could afford groceries or stressing about making rent. Tyler, meanwhile, did get recruited to play soccer at a small college in California. The recruiting consultant had done their job, and he received a partial athletic scholarship that covered about 60% of his tuition. The remaining costs, of course, were covered by our parents, who were thrilled to support their sons' college experience in ways they had never offered to support mine. The calls home became less frequent as I settled into my new life in Colorado. When we did talk, the conversations followed familiar patterns. Mom would update me on Tyler's classes and soccer season, on Dad's approaching retirement, on their social life and travel plans. They would ask about my job and my apartment, but the questions felt superficial, like they were checking boxes rather than expressing genuine interest in my life. I dated occasionally, made friends with coworkers, and slowly began to understand what it felt like to live without constant financial stress. I started taking weekend trips to explore Colorado, something I had never been able to afford as a student. I bought furniture that wasn't secondhand and clothes that weren't from thrift stores. Small luxuries that felt revolutionary after years of scarcity. But underneath the satisfaction of building my career and creating my own life was a growing awareness of something I had always known but never fully acknowledged. My parents had made a choice about which child deserved support and which child could manage alone. They had looked at their two children and decided that one needed investment and the other needed character building. They had prioritized Tyler's comfort over my financial stability, his potential over my actual achievements. The awareness didn't make me bitter exactly, but it did make me clear-headed about the nature of our family relationships. I stopped expecting them to ask about my student loan payments or acknowledge the difficulty of what they had asked me to do. I stopped hoping they would recognize the disparity in how they had launched their children into adulthood. Instead, I focused on building the life I wanted, using the independence they had insisted I develop. Years passed. I got promoted, moved to a better apartment, and started contributing to my own retirement account while still making substantial monthly payments on my student loans. Tyler graduated from college and moved back home, uncertain about his next steps and in no hurry to figure them out. My parents seemed content to support him while he explored his options, just as they had always supported him while he figured things out. The distance between Denver and Phoenix felt like more than geographical. Miles. It felt like the space between two different philosophies about family, about fairness, about what children owe their parents, and what parents owe their children. I had learned to thrive in the independence they had insisted I embrace, but I had also learned that independence meant making my own choices about family obligations. I thought I had made peace with all of this. I thought I understood our family dynamics and had found my place within them. I thought the hardest lessons about money and fairness and expectations had already been learned during those difficult college years. I had no idea that the real test was still coming, hidden in my parents' retirement planning and financial decisions that would force me to confront the true cost of the choice they had made when I was 18 years old. I had no idea that their need for my signature on financial documents would reveal the full scope of their hypocrisy and force me to decide, once and for all, what I owed to people who had given me independence when what I needed was support. The call came on a Tuesday evening in March, just as I was settling in with takeout Thai food and a Netflix series I had been meaning to catch up on. Denver was experiencing one of those late winter storms that reminded you spring was still a negotiation rather than a promise, and I was grateful to be inside my warm apartment with nowhere I needed to be. Mom's name flashed on my phone screen, which was unusual. Our conversations had settled into a predictable pattern of Sunday afternoon check-ins, brief and pleasant exchanges that covered the surface of our lives without diving into anything too deep. A Tuesday evening call suggested something different. and I felt a familiar flutter of anxiety as I answered. "Hi, Mom. Everything okay?" "Oh, Jessica, yes. Everything's fine," she said, but there was something in her voice that contradicted her words. A tightness, a rehearsed quality that meant she had been thinking about this conversation before making the call. "I hope I'm not interrupting your evening." "Not at all, just having dinner. What's going on?" There was a pause, and I could hear Dad's voice in the background, though I couldn't make out the words. Mom's voice became slightly muffled as she spoke to him, and then she was back on the line with that same artificially bright tone. "Well, your father and I have been working with our financial advisor on some retirement planning, and there's a small administrative thing we need to take care of. Nothing major, just some paperwork that requires a family member's signature." I set down my chopsticks, my attention fully focused on the conversation now. "What kind of paperwork?" "Oh, you know how these financial institutions are, always requiring extra signatures and documentation for everything. Our advisor says it's completely routine, just part of accessing some of the retirement accounts your father set up years ago. We need a co-signer for certain withdrawals." Something about the explanation felt off. Too casual for something that required a co-signer. Too dismissive for something that involved retirement funds. "Why do you need a co-signer? Aren't they your accounts?" Mom's laugh sounded forced. "Well, that's the silly thing about some of these older accounts. When your father set them up, he was thinking about estate planning and family security, so he structured them in a way that requires family member approval for early access. It seemed like a good idea at the time. Early access. That phrase caught my attention immediately. "You're taking early withdrawals from retirement accounts?" "Not exactly early, Jessica. Your father is 62, which qualifies for some distributions. It's just that the accounts have these additional family signature requirements that seemed prudent when he was younger." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process what she was telling me. Dad was 62, which meant he could access some retirement benefits, but early withdrawals typically came with significant penalties and tax implications. And the idea that he had set up accounts requiring family signatures seemed unusual. For someone who had always been financially independent and controlling. "Why not ask Tyler to co-sign?" I asked, though I suspected I knew the answer. Another pause, longer this time. "Well, Tyler is still getting established in his career, and these documents require someone with a stable financial history and credit rating. The financial institution wants someone who has demonstrated long-term fiscal responsibility." There. It was. Tyler, who was 25 and had been living at home since graduating college, wasn't considered financially responsible enough to co-sign documents. But Jessica, who had been financially independent since 18 and had never missed, a student loan payment was the obvious choice for handling their financial needs. "What exactly would I be signing?" I asked. "Just authorization forms, really. Nothing that would make you financially responsible for anything." The advisor explained that it's purely administrative, giving permission for your father to access funds that are already his. "I can email you the documents if you'd like to review them." The offer to review the documents was reassuring, but something still felt incomplete about the explanation. "Mom, can I ask why you need to access these accounts now? Are you having financial difficulties?" "Oh no, sweetheart, nothing like that. Your father's retirement is going very well, and we're comfortable. This is more about tax planning and investment restructuring. Our advisor thinks it makes sense to move some money around before the end of the fiscal year." That explanation made more sense. Financial advisors often recommended restructuring investments for tax purposes, and accessing retirement accounts as part of a broader strategy wasn't unusual. I started to relax, thinking that maybe I had been overthinking the situation. "Okay, go ahead and send me the documents. I'll take a look and let you know if I have any questions." "Wonderful. Thank you so much, Jessica. I knew we could count on you. I'll send everything over tonight, and if you could get them back to us within the next week or so, that would be perfect." After we hung up, I finished my dinner while thinking about the conversation. It wasn't unusual for adult children to help their parents with financial paperwork, especially as people approached retirement age. I had friends whose parents had asked them to review insurance policies or help with tax preparation. And despite our complicated history around college funding, my parents had always been responsible with money and planning. The email arrived later that evening with the subject line, "Retirement documents. Please review." I opened it while sitting at my desk with a cup of coffee, expecting to find straightforward authorization forms that I could sign and return quickly. Instead, I found a collection of documents that were far more complex than Mom had described. There were forms from 3 different financial institutions, each requiring different types of signatures and authorizations. Some were requesting permission for specific withdrawal amounts, others were authorizing ongoing access to accounts, and several included language about assuming responsibility for tax obligations and potential penalties. The numbers involved were substantial. Dad was requesting access to over $200,000 across multiple accounts, some of which appeared to be 401k funds that would indeed incur early withdrawal penalties. The tax implications alone would be significant, potentially pushing them into a higher tax bracket and creating a substantial bill for the following year. But what caught my attention most was a section in one of the documents that outlined the reasons for early withdrawal. Instead of the investment restructuring and tax planning Mom had mentioned, the forms indicated financial hardship and immediate cash flow needs. There were references to outstanding debts and monthly obligations that couldn't be met through regular income. I read through everything twice, then started researching the financial institutions and the specific types of accounts involved. What I discovered made my stomach drop. These weren't just retirement accounts with family signature requirements. They were accounts that Dad had set up as joint assets, with me listed as a co-beneficiary and co-responsible party. By signing these documents, I wouldn't just be giving permission for withdrawals. I would be accepting partial responsibility for the financial consequences of those withdrawals. The more I read, the more I realized how significantly my parents had misrepresented the situation. This wasn't routine paperwork or simple investment restructuring. This was a substantial early withdrawal from retirement accounts that would result in penalties, taxes, and long-term financial consequences. And by involving me as a co-signer, they were attempting to share the financial responsibility for those consequences. I stayed up late that night, researching retirement account regulations and early withdrawal penalties, trying to understand the full scope of what I was being asked to sign. The financial implications were staggering. The penalties alone would be in the tens of thousands, and the tax obligations could easily double that amount. This wasn't strategic financial planning. This was the kind of desperate move that people made when they had exhausted other options. The next morning, I called in sick to work and spent the day trying to understand my parents' financial situation. I couldn't access their accounts or get detailed information, but I could piece together clues from the documents they had sent me. The withdrawal amounts, the urgency of the timeline, the complex cosigner requirements, everything pointed to a financial crisis that they hadn't disclosed. I thought about calling Mom immediately to ask for clarification, but something held me back. Maybe it was years of being the responsible one, the daughter who handled problems independently. Maybe it was a growing awareness that this situation was more complicated than family paperwork. Or maybe it was the nagging feeling that I was being asked to clean up a mess that I hadn't helped create, using financial credentials that I had built through years of careful, independent money management. Instead, I decided to do more research. I called a financial advisor that I had consulted when setting up my own retirement accounts, explaining that I needed to understand the implications of co-signing withdrawal documents for family members. The conversation was enlightening and deeply troubling. What you're describing sounds like substantial early retirement withdrawals with significant penalties, the advisor explained. The cosigner requirements suggest either complex trust structures or accounts that were set up to distribute responsibility for financial consequences. Before signing anything, you should understand exactly what financial obligations you might be assuming. What kind of obligations? Potentially tax liability, penalty responsibility, and in some cases, ongoing account management duties. If these accounts were structured as joint assets, the co-signer could become responsible for portions of the tax burden and penalties. It's not uncommon for financial institutions to require co-signers precisely because they want multiple parties responsible for potential losses. I felt the blood drain from my face. So, by signing these documents, I could become financially responsible for someone else's retirement account withdrawals? It's possible, depending on how the accounts were originally structured. I would strongly recommend having an independent financial advisor review everything before you sign. And I would want to understand why these withdrawals are necessary, and whether there are alternative solutions that don't involve early retirement account access. After that conversation, I spent the rest of the day in a strange state of suspended anxiety. I kept thinking about Mom's casual explanation, about the routine nature she had described, about the administrative simplicity she had promised. None of that matched what I was learning about the actual documents and their implications. That evening, I called Mom back. This time, I was prepared with specific questions and a clear understanding of what the documents actually contained. Hi, Mom, I've been reviewing the paperwork you sent and I have some questions. Of course, sweetheart. I hope it all makes sense. Our advisor said it was pretty straightforward. Actually, it doesn't seem straightforward at all. These look like early withdrawal requests for substantial amounts, with significant penalties and tax implications. And some of the documents suggest that I would be accepting financial responsibility for portions of those consequences. There was a long pause. When Mom spoke again, her voice had lost its casual tone. I think you might be misunderstanding some of the technical language. These financial documents always make things sound more complicated than they are. Mom, I consulted with a financial advisor today. What you're asking me to sign could make me partially responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in penalties and taxes. That's not administrative paperwork. That's a major financial decision. Another pause, longer this time. I could hear muffled conversation in the background, Dad's voice more urgent now. When Mom came back on the line, she sounded defensive. Jessica, we wouldn't ask you to do anything that would hurt you financially. We're your parents. We want what's best for you. Then help me understand why you need early access to retirement accounts and why the documents indicate financial hardship rather than investment restructuring. The silence stretched so long that I wondered if the call had been dropped. Finally, Mom's voice came back, smaller and less confident than before. Things have been a little tighter than we expected since your father's retirement. Some investments didn't perform as well as projected, and we have some obligations that need to be addressed sooner than we planned. What kind of obligations? Just normal expenses that have accumulated, medical bills, home maintenance, some credit cards that got higher than we intended. Nothing we can't handle, but we need some liquidity to get things back on track. I felt a familiar sinking sensation, the same feeling I had experienced years earlier when they explained why they couldn't help with college costs while planning expensive support for Tyler. This was starting to feel like another situation where their poor financial planning was becoming my responsibility to resolve. Mom, how much debt are we talking about? It's not that much, really. Maybe $60,000 or $70,000 across various accounts. We just need to consolidate some things and get a better payment structure in place. $60,000 or $70,000. Nearly the same amount I had borrowed for college. The amount they had been unable to help with because they needed to save money for Tyler's future expenses. They had accumulated this debt during the same years when I was working multiple jobs and eating ramen noodles to afford textbooks. What about Tyler? I asked. Is he helping with any of this? Tyler is still establishing his career. We don't want to burden him with financial stress while he's trying to get started. There. It was again. Tyler needed protection from financial stress, but Jessica could handle the burden of co-signing documents that might make her responsible for their retirement account penalties. Tyler was establishing his career at 25, but Jessica had been expected to handle her own financial stress since 18. Mom, I need to think about this. These documents are more complex than you initially described, and I need to understand all the implications before I sign anything. Of course, sweetheart. Take all the time you need. We just hope you'll help us when you can. Family is about supporting each other through difficult times. After we hung up, I sat in my apartment feeling like I was 18 again, being told that college was my responsibility, while Tyler's needs were the family's priority. The patterns were so familiar, so deeply ingrained, that it took me a moment to realize how much I had changed since those early conversations about independence and responsibility. I wasn't 18 anymore. I wasn't financially vulnerable or dependent on their approval. I had built my own career and my own financial stability without their help, and I no longer needed to accept their definitions of family obligation and support. But I also wasn't ready to make any decisions based on anger or hurt feelings from the past. This situation required careful consideration of the facts, clear understanding of the consequences, and honest evaluation of what I owed to people who had made very specific choices about which of their children deserved financial support. I decided to take a few days to process everything I had learned, to consult with professionals who could help me understand the full implications of what I was being asked to do. Because this wasn't just about retirement account paperwork. This was about whether I was willing to use the financial stability I had built independently to solve problems created by the same people who had insisted that I learn to solve my own problems. The next few days passed in a blur of research and consultation. I spoke with tax professionals about early withdrawal penalties, with lawyers about co-signer responsibilities, and with financial advisors about retirement account structures. Each conversation confirmed what I had begun to suspect. My parents were asking me to assume significant financial risk to help them access money they needed because of their own poor financial decisions. By Friday, I had a clear understanding of the situation and the choice I needed to make. The documents they wanted me to sign would make me partially responsible for substantial penalties and taxes, while giving me no control over how the withdrawn money would be used. I would be helping them access funds to pay off debts they had accumulated, while refusing to help me with educational expenses they considered my responsibility. The irony was almost poetic. They wanted my signature because I had demonstrated the kind of long-term financial responsibility they had insisted I develop independently. They needed my help because I had succeeded financially, despite their refusal to support my educational goals. They were asking me to risk the financial stability I had built without their help to solve financial problems they had created while building security for Tyler. I knew what I needed to do. I just wasn't sure I was ready to do it. Saturday morning arrived with the kind of crystalline Colorado sunshine that made everything seem possible and clear. I had spent the night making lists, reviewing documents one final time, and practicing conversations in my head. By the time I finished my first cup of coffee, I knew exactly what I needed to say and exactly why I needed to say it. I called Mom at 9 a.m., knowing that was early enough to catch them before they started their weekend activities, but late enough that they would both be awake and alert. Dad answered the phone, which was unusual enough to throw off my carefully rehearsed opening. "Hi, Dad, it's Jessica. I was hoping to talk with you and Mom about the retirement documents." "Oh, good morning, sweetheart. Your mother said you were reviewing everything. Have you had a chance to look things over?" His tone was casual, expectant, as if he assumed I would simply sign and return the paperwork without further discussion. The presumption in his voice reminded me of how he had spoken about college funding years earlier, as if my compliance with their decisions was a foregone conclusion. "I have looked everything over very carefully, Dad. In fact, I've spent the Last few days consulting with financial advisors and tax professionals to make sure I understand exactly what I'm being asked to sign. There was a pause, and I heard him calling for Mom to pick up the extension. A moment later, her voice joined the conversation, and I could hear the tension that hadn't been there in our previous discussions. "Hi, Jessica. I hope the documents weren't too confusing. Like I said, these financial institutions make everything sound more complicated than it really is. Actually, Mom, they're exactly as complicated as they appear to be. What you're asking me to sign would make me partially responsible for over $40,000 in early withdrawal penalties and tax obligations. These aren't administrative forms. They're major financial commitments." The silence that followed was heavy with the weight of truth finally being acknowledged. Dad was the first to speak, and his voice had lost its casual confidence. "Jessica, I think there might be some misunderstanding about the technical details. Our financial advisor assured us that the cosigner responsibilities were minimal." "Which financial advisor?" I asked, because I'd like to speak with them directly about these minimal responsibilities. Another pause. When Mom spoke, her voice had that strained quality it got when she was trying to manage a situation that was slipping out of her control. "Well, we've been working with someone Tyler recommended, actually. Someone he met through a friend who specializes in retirement planning. Tyler recommended, of course. The same Tyler who had never managed his own finances, who was still living at home at 25, who had been deemed too financially unstable to co-sign these documents himself. But somehow, his financial advisor recommendation was trustworthy, enough to guide major retirement decisions. Mom, I need you both to be completely honest with me about your financial situation. The documents I'm looking at indicate substantial debt and immediate cash flow problems. This isn't strategic investment, restructuring. This is financial crisis management." Dad's voice became defensive, taking on the tone he used when he felt his authority was being challenged. "Jessica, we don't need to justify our financial decisions to our children. We're asking for help with paperwork, not a lecture about money management." Something inside me snapped at that response. The same man who had lectured me about the value of independence when I needed help with college costs was now dismissing my questions about taking on financial responsibility for his retirement decisions. "Dad, you're not asking for help with paperwork. You're asking me to risk my financial security to fix problems that you and Mom created, and you're doing it the same way you handled my college funding, by telling me it's my responsibility to figure it out while protecting Tyler from any financial burden." "That's not fair, Jessica," Mom interjected. "These situations are completely different." "Are they? Because from where I'm sitting, they look remarkably similar. When I needed help with education costs, you told me I was capable and independent, and needed to handle it myself. Tyler got recruiting consultants and full financial support because he needed more guidance. Now you need help with financial problems, and once again, Tyler is too delicate to be involved while I'm expected to step up and handle the complicated parts." Dad's voice rose slightly, taking on the edge of anger that I remembered from childhood arguments. "You're being dramatic, Jessica. We raised you to be strong and self-sufficient, and you've succeeded. We're proud of what you've accomplished. And now we're asking you to help family when we need it." "I did succeed, Dad, despite being told that college was too expensive for the family budget while you planned to spend $15,000 on Tyler's recruiting consultant. Despite working 40 hours a week while carrying a full course load because family financial support wasn't available for the responsible child. I succeeded because I had to, not because you taught me valuable lessons about independence." Mom's voice became pleading, taking on the manipulative tone that had always been her go-to strategy when direct confrontation wasn't working. "Jessica, you sound so angry about things that happened years ago. We did the best we could with the resources we had. Different children need different kinds of support." "You're right, Mom. Different children do need different kinds of support. Tyler needed protection from financial responsibility, so you gave it to him. I needed help with educational expenses, so you taught me independence. Tyler needs shelter from your current financial problems, so you're protecting him again. I need protection from assuming responsibility for your retirement account penalties, but apparently I don't qualify for that kind of consideration. The conversation was spiraling into territory that we had never directly addressed before, bringing years of unspoken resentment and inequality into the harsh light of explicit discussion. I could hear both of them breathing heavily, and I knew we were approaching a point of no return. Dad made one more attempt to regain control of the situation, using the authoritative tone that had always ended arguments when I was younger. Jessica, we are your parents. We sacrificed for you and Tyler your entire childhoods, and now we're asking for help when we need it. This is what family does. We support each other. What family does, I said slowly, is support each other, equitably. What family does is recognize when one child has been carrying an unfair burden and adjust accordingly. What you do is ask the same child to solve every financial problem while protecting the other child from ever having to contribute. Tyler contributes in other ways, Mom said weakly. What ways, Mom? What does Tyler contribute to this family? Besides showing up for holidays and accepting financial support, when has he ever been asked to sacrifice for the good of the family? When has he ever been told that he's strong enough to handle something difficult independently? The questions hung in the air like accusations, because that's exactly what they were. I was accusing my parents of favoritism, of creating a family dynamic where one child was systematically exploited while the other was systematically enabled. I was saying out loud what I had known but never voiced for over a decade. We love both of you equally, Dad said, but his voice lacked conviction. Love isn't the issue, Dad. The issue is fairness. The issue is whether you can love someone while consistently treating them as less deserving of support and protection. The issue is whether asking me to solve your financial problems while keeping Tyler ignorant of them demonstrates equal love or just convenient utilization. Mom tried a different approach, her voice becoming softer and more vulnerable. Jessica, we know we've made mistakes. We know things haven't always been perfectly fair. But we're in a difficult situation now, and we need help from someone we trust. You trust me to fix your problems, Mom, but you didn't trust me enough to deserve equal support when I had problems. You trust my financial judgment now, but you didn't trust that I was worth investing in when I needed educational funding. You trust me to handle the complicated consequences of your retirement planning, but Tyler can't be trusted with even knowing that these problems exist. The conversation was becoming emotionally exhausting, but I felt like I was finally saying things that had needed to be said for years. The 18-year-old who had accepted their explanations about college funding wouldn't have been able to articulate these disparities. The 29-year-old who had built financial stability without their help was perfectly capable of identifying and rejecting their patterns of inequitable treatment. So what are you saying? Dad asked. Are you going to help us or not? The directness of his question cut through all the emotional manipulation and family guilt to the core issue. He wanted a yes or no answer to whether I would sign documents that could cost me tens of thousands of dollars to solve problems they had created, while systematically excluding Tyler from any financial responsibility. I'm saying that I'm not going to sign those documents, Dad. I'm not going to risk my financial security to enable your poor financial planning, especially when you're simultaneously protecting Tyler from even knowing that help is needed. Jessica, if you don't help us, we could lose the house, Mom said, her voice breaking slightly. It was the guilt trip I had been expecting, the nuclear option that was supposed to make me feel responsible for their financial catastrophe. But instead of guilt, I felt a strange sense of clarity. Mom, if you're at risk of losing your house, then you need to involve Tyler in these conversations and decisions. If this is truly a family crisis, then the entire family needs to be aware of it and contributing to solutions. If Tyler is too financially unstable to help with retirement account problems, Maybe he's also too financially stable to keep living at home without contributing to household expenses. You want us to burden Tyler with this stress? Dad asked, sounding incredulous. I want you to treat Tyler like an adult member of this family instead of a child who needs protection. I want you to stop asking me to handle family financial problems while keeping Tyler completely insulated from family financial realities. I want you to recognize that the same standards of independence and capability that you applied to me when I was 18 should maybe also apply to him now that he's 25. The silence that followed was different from the previous pauses in our conversation. This wasn't the silence of people thinking about what to say next. This was the silence of people confronting truths they had been avoiding for years. When Mom spoke again, her voice was small and defensive. We were just trying to do what we thought was best for both of you. No, Mom. You were doing what was easiest for both of you. It was easier to ask me to handle college costs independently than to figure out how to support both children equally. It was easier to invest in Tyler's recruiting consultant than to acknowledge that you had also invested in my education. And it's easier to ask me to co-sign retirement documents than to have difficult conversations with Tyler about family financial responsibilities. We never meant for you to feel like we favored Tyler, Dad said. Intent doesn't matter as much as impact, Dad. You can't tell someone they need to develop independence while simultaneously developing dependence in their sibling and then act surprised when the pattern becomes clear. You can't ask the self-sufficient child to solve problems while protecting the dependent child from knowing problems exist and expect it to feel like equal treatment. I could hear Mom crying softly in the background, and part of me felt guilty for causing her distress. But a larger part of me felt relieved to finally be speaking honestly about dynamics that had shaped our family for years. So what happens now? Dad asked. Now you figure out your financial problems without involving me. You talk to Tyler about whether he can contribute to household expenses or help in other ways. You explore alternatives to early retirement withdrawals that don't require family co-signers. You take responsibility for the financial decisions you've made instead of asking me to share responsibility for the consequences. And if we can't figure it out? Mom asked. Then you'll figure it out the same way I figured out college funding, when you couldn't help. You'll learn about independence and resourcefulness and making difficult choices. You'll discover what it feels like to solve financial problems without family support, which might give you some perspective on what you asked me to do when I was 18. The harshness of my words surprised even me, but they felt necessary. For over a decade, I had accepted their explanations and justifications, had internalized their messages about independence and capability, had convinced myself that their differential treatment was somehow reasonable or necessary. Now I was rejecting all of that and demanding that they confront the reality of their choices. Jessica, Dad said slowly, are you saying you're cutting us off? Are you saying you won't help family when we need it? I'm saying I won't enable patterns that have been harmful to our family relationships. I'm saying that if you want my help with financial problems, Tyler needs to be equally involved in those conversations and decisions. I'm saying that I won't continue being the responsible child who handles difficult situations while Tyler remains the protected child who's shielded from family realities. That sounds like an ultimatum, Mom said. It's a boundary, Mom. It's me finally applying the same standards to family relationships that I learned to apply to other areas of my life. I won't accept differential treatment disguised as family support, and I won't risk my financial security to solve problems that I didn't create and that others are being protected from addressing. We talked for another 20 minutes, but the essential conversation was over. They continued trying various approaches to convince me to sign the documents: emotional appeals about family loyalty, logical arguments about their financial needs, guilt trips about abandoning parents in crisis, promises about future appreciation and payback. I listened to all of it and responded to none of it, because I had finally learned the difference between family obligation and family exploitation. When we finally hung up, I felt emotionally drained, but also strangely energized. I had spent years wondering if I was being too sensitive about the differences in how my parents treated their children. I had questioned whether my perceptions of favoritism were accurate or fair. I had worried that I was being selfish by wanting equal consideration and support. But this conversation had crystallized everything. When they needed financial help, they approached the child who had demonstrated financial responsibility. When that same child had needed financial help, they had been told to develop financial responsibility independently. The pattern was clear, consistent, and completely unfair. I spent the rest of the day thinking about next steps. I knew this conversation would have consequences, that my refusal to sign the documents would likely create significant tension in our family relationships. I knew my parents would probably involve Tyler in their version of events, positioning me as the ungrateful daughter who abandoned family in crisis. I knew I would probably be painted as selfish and cold, someone who had forgotten where she came from and who she owed. But I also knew that I had finally stood up for myself in a way that 18-year-old Jessica never could have managed. I had identified patterns of unfair treatment and refused to continue participating in them. I had chosen my own financial security over their financial convenience, the same choice they had made when they chose Tyler's future comfort over my immediate educational needs. The decision felt right in a way that surprised me. I had expected guilt and doubt and worry about damaging family relationships. Instead, I felt clear and calm and proud of finally setting boundaries that protected my own interests, instead of automatically sacrificing them for others' convenience. I knew the real test would come in the following days and weeks, when they regrouped and tried new strategies to change my mind, when they involved Tyler and other family members in their campaign to convince me to help. I knew they would escalate their efforts and increase the pressure because the financial stakes were substantial and my signature was crucial to their plans. But I also knew that I had finally learned the difference between helping family and being exploited by family. I had learned that real family support should be reciprocal and equitable, not one-sided and convenient. I had learned that saying no to unfair requests wasn't selfish. It was necessary for maintaining healthy relationships and personal dignity. The phone calls would continue. The pressure would intensify. The guilt trips would become more sophisticated and emotionally manipulative. But I had finally found my voice and my boundaries, and I was ready to defend both of them against whatever came next. The first text from Tyler came 3 hours after my phone call with our parents. I was at the grocery store, mentally planning meals for the week, when my phone buzzed with a message that immediately changed the entire trajectory of my Sunday. "Hey Jess, Mom and Dad told me about the retirement stuff. Can we talk?" I stared at the message while standing in the produce section, holding a bag of apples and feeling like the ground had shifted beneath my feet. So they had told Tyler. After years of protecting him from family financial realities, after insisting he was too unstable to co-sign documents, after positioning him as too delicate to handle stress about money, they had suddenly decided he was mature enough to be involved in convincing me to change my mind. I finished my shopping before responding, using the time to think about how I wanted to handle this conversation. Tyler had never been directly involved in our family's financial dynamics before. He had been the beneficiary of parental protection and support, but he had never been asked to advocate for family financial decisions or mediate between me and our parents. "Sure, we can talk. What did they tell you?" His response came immediately, as if he had been waiting by his phone. "They said you're refusing to help with some paperwork they need for Dad's retirement accounts. They're really stressed about it. Paperwork." Even when involving Tyler, they were still describing the situation as simple administrative tasks rather than the complex financial obligations I would be assuming. They were asking him to pressure me based on incomplete information, just as they had asked me to sign documents based on misleading explanations. "It's more complicated than paperwork, Tyler." Did they explain that I would be financially responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in penalties and taxes? My phone rang almost immediately. Tyler's voice sounded genuinely confused and slightly irritated, as if I was overcomplicating something that should be straightforward. Jess, what are you talking about? Mom said it was just signature requirements for Dad to access his own retirement money. She didn't say anything about you being responsible for penalties. I felt a familiar surge of frustration, not at Tyler specifically, but at the pattern of selective information sharing that our parents had perfected over the years. They had told him enough to enlist his help in pressuring me, but not enough for him to understand what they were actually asking me to do. Tyler, did they tell you they've accumulated $60,000 to $70,000 in debt? Did they explain that Dad is requesting early withdrawals from retirement accounts, which come with substantial penalties? Did they mention that the cosigner requirements exist specifically because the financial institutions want multiple parties responsible for those penalties? The silence on the other end of the line was telling. When Tyler spoke again, his voice had lost its confident edge. They didn't mention debt. They said it was investment restructuring for tax purposes. What else didn't they mention? Did they tell you why they approached me instead of asking you to co-sign? Another pause. They said the bank required someone with an established credit history and stable income. Did they tell you that means you're considered too financially irresponsible to assume this obligation, but I'm expected to risk my financial security to solve their problems? Tyler's voice became defensive, taking on the tone he had used since childhood when he felt criticized or challenged. Look, I know I'm not as financially successful as you are, but that doesn't mean I don't care about helping Mom and Dad when they need it. Then why aren't you helping, Tyler? If this is really about family support and caring about our parents, why are you calling to convince me to sign documents instead of figuring out how you can contribute to solving their financial problems? Because I can't co-sign bank documents, Jess. You said so yourself. I don't have the credit history or income they require. There are other ways to help with financial problems besides co-signing retirement account withdrawals. Have you offered to pay rent for living at their house? Have you suggested getting a full-time job to contribute to household expenses? Have you looked into whether there are alternatives to early retirement withdrawals that might avoid the penalties entirely? The question seemed to catch him off guard, as if the idea of contributing financially to the family had never occurred to him. When he responded, his voice carried a hint of confusion mixed with annoyance. I do help around the house, and I'm looking for better job opportunities. But this situation needs immediate attention, and you're the one who can actually solve it. There it was again. The assumption that solving family financial problems was my responsibility because I had the capability to do so. The same logic that had made college funding my problem because I was capable of handling it independently, while Tyler's future needs remained the family's collective responsibility because he needed more support. Tyler, I want you to think about what you just said. You believe this situation needs immediate attention, and you believe I should solve it because I have the capability. But you're not considering what it cost me to develop that capability, or whether it's fair to ask me to risk the financial stability I built without family help to solve problems created by the same people who refused to help me build that stability. What does college have to do with anything? Tyler asked, sounding genuinely perplexed. That was years ago. His confusion was almost endearing in its complete lack of awareness. Tyler truly didn't understand the connection between our parents' refusal to support my education and their current expectation that I would support their retirement planning. He had been so thoroughly insulated from family financial realities that he couldn't see the patterns of differential treatment that had shaped our relationships for over a decade. Tyler, do you know how much money Mom and Dad spent on your recruiting consultant when you were applying to colleges? I don't know, maybe a few $1,000s. Why? $15,000. They spent $15,000 to help. You get college recruitment opportunities during the same period when they told me they couldn't afford to help with my tuition costs. That's different, Jess. I needed athletic recruiting help, and you were academically strong enough to get scholarships on your own. The casual dismissal of the disparity was stunning, but also illuminating. Tyler genuinely believed that the differential treatment was justified, that his needs had been more legitimate than mine, that our parents' investment in his success was reasonable while their refusal to invest in mine was simply practical. I didn't get enough scholarships to cover my costs, Tyler. I graduated with $85,000 in student loan debt. I worked 40 hours a week while taking a full course load because our parents chose to save their money for your future expenses instead of helping with my current ones. But you turned out fine. You have a good job and a nice apartment. The loans worked out. His response revealed the depth of his disconnect from the reality of what I had experienced. In Tyler's mind, the outcome justified the process, because I had ultimately succeeded, despite the lack of family support. He saw no problem with the way our parents had allocated their resources and attention. Tyler, I turned out fine despite being denied family support, not because of it. I succeeded by learning to rely entirely on myself, by working multiple jobs while my classmates studied, by eating ramen noodles for months to afford textbooks. The fact that I survived that experience doesn't make it fair or reasonable. I don't know what you want me to say, Jess. I didn't make those decisions about college funding. I want you to understand that the same patterns are happening now. Mom and Dad have financial problems, and they're asking me to solve them while protecting you from even understanding what those problems involve. They're using the financial stability I built independently to handle consequences of decisions they made while building financial security for you. Tyler was quiet for a long moment, and I could almost hear him thinking through the implications of what I was saying. When he spoke again, his voice was more thoughtful, but still resistant. Even if there were some unfair things in the past, that doesn't mean you should abandon Mom and Dad when they need help now. I'm not abandoning them, Tyler. I'm refusing to perpetuate patterns that have been harmful to our family relationships. If they need help with financial problems, then both of their adult children should be involved in understanding those problems and contributing to solutions. But I can't co-sign the documents they need. Then maybe early retirement withdrawals with co-signer requirements aren't the right solution. Maybe you should get a full-time job and contribute to household expenses so they don't need to access retirement funds. Maybe we should explore debt consolidation options that don't involve penalties and family co-signers. Maybe both of us should be involved in understanding their financial situation and brainstorming alternatives. The conversation continued for another 30 minutes, but I could tell that Tyler wasn't truly hearing what I was saying. He had spent his entire adult life being protected from financial responsibility and family financial stress. The idea that he should be equally involved in solving family financial problems was foreign to him, just as the idea that I deserved equal family support had been foreign to our parents. When we finally hung up, I knew the call had accomplished exactly what our parents had hoped it would. Tyler would report back that I was being stubborn and unreasonable, that I was holding grudges about ancient history, that I was choosing past resentments over current family needs. He would become another voice in their campaign to convince me to sign the documents, adding family pressure to their emotional manipulation. But the conversation had also accomplished something our parents probably hadn't anticipated. It had revealed the extent to which Tyler was genuinely unaware of family financial dynamics and his own privileged position within them. His confusion about the college funding disparities, his assumption that his needs had been more legitimate than mine, his inability to see connections between past patterns and current situations. All of it demonstrated how successfully our parents had insulated him from uncomfortable truths about family fairness and resource allocation. The next call came from my Aunt Maria, Dad's sister, who lived in Tucson and had always maintained close relationships with our immediate family. Her voice was carefully neutral when she called Monday evening, but I could tell she was on a mission. "Hi, Jessica. I hope you don't mind me calling. Your father mentioned that there's some family stress happening around financial planning, and I wondered if there was anything I could do to help." I almost laughed at the diplomatic phrasing, family stress around financial planning, as if the issue was communication breakdown rather than years of inequitable treatment and unreasonable expectations. "Hi, Aunt Maria. What exactly did Dad tell you?" "Just that there were some documents you needed to review for his retirement, accounts, and that there seemed to be some misunderstanding about the requirements. He's worried that family tensions are getting in the way of practical solutions." Misunderstanding. Another euphemism designed to minimize the real issues while making me sound like the problem. According to this version of events, I was simply confused about straightforward requirements and family tensions were preventing reasonable resolution. "There's no misunderstanding, Aunt Maria. Mom and Dad want me to co-sign documents that would make me financially responsible for substantial penalties and taxes related to early retirement withdrawals. They've accumulated significant debt and need access to retirement funds to address it, but they're asking me to share responsibility for the financial consequences while keeping Tyler completely uninformed about the situation." The silence on the other end of the line told me that Aunt Maria had not been given anything close to the full story. When she spoke again, her voice was more careful and less confident. "I didn't realize the situation was so complex. Your father made it sound like routine paperwork. Did he tell you that Tyler was considered too financially unstable to be involved, but that I should risk my financial security to help solve problems I didn't create?" "No, he didn't mention Tyler's involvement at all." Of course he hadn't. Just as they had selectively informed Tyler about my supposed stubbornness without explaining the financial realities, they had selectively informed Aunt Maria about family tensions without mentioning the fundamental unfairness of what they were requesting. "Aunt Maria, I appreciate your concern about family harmony, but this isn't about misunderstanding or tensions. This is about whether I'm willing to continue accepting differential treatment that has been harmful to our family relationships for years." "What do you mean by differential treatment?" I found myself explaining the same patterns I had outlined to Tyler, the same history of unequal support and expectations, the same connections between past and present that seemed invisible to family members who had never been asked to examine them critically. Aunt Maria listened without interrupting, and I could hear her processing information that clearly contradicted whatever version of events she had been given. "Jessica, I had no idea about any of this. Your father said you were being unreasonable about helping family, but what you're describing sounds much more complicated." "It is complicated, which is why I'm not willing to sign documents that could cost me tens of thousands of dollars, without careful consideration of whether this is actually the best solution for everyone involved." We talked for another 20 minutes, and by the end of the conversation, Aunt Maria's tone had shifted from diplomatic mediation to genuine concern about family dynamics she had never fully understood. She promised not to report our conversation back to my parents, and she suggested that maybe they needed to explore alternatives that didn't involve family cosigners. But I knew that Aunt Maria's change of perspective wouldn't stop the campaign to change my mind. If anything, my parents would probably interpret her failure to convince me as evidence that I was becoming increasingly unreasonable and needed more intensive intervention. The text messages started coming regularly after that, not just from Tyler, but from family friends who had been told selected versions of the story, cousins who had heard that I was refusing to help my parents during financial difficulties, family friends who had been informed about my stubbornness and lack of family loyalty. Each message followed similar patterns. Expressions of concern about family relationships, gentle suggestions that I reconsider my position, reminders about the importance of supporting parents in their time of need, implications that I was being selfish or holding grudges that were harming family unity. None of the messages indicated any awareness of the full situation. None of them mentioned the debt my parents had accumulated, the penalties and taxes I would be responsible for, the years of differential treatment that had led to this moment. All of them positioned me as the problem and my parents as innocent, victims of their daughter's unreasonable behavior. I started taking screenshots of the messages, not because I planned to use them for anything, but because I wanted documentation of how thoroughly my parents had misrepresented the situation. To build support for their position, it was fascinating and disturbing to see how effectively they had mobilized family and social networks based on incomplete and misleading information. The social media posts started appearing by Wednesday. Nothing direct or obvious, just subtle. Messages about family loyalty and supporting parents in difficult times. Photos from family gatherings with captions about the importance of sticking together during challenges. Quotes about gratitude and remembering where you came from. Mom posted a picture of herself and Dad at their dining room table, surrounded by financial documents with a caption that read, "Trying to navigate retirement planning at our age is overwhelming, but we're grateful for family who understand that we're all in this together." Tyler shared the post with his own comment. "Family is everything. When people you love need help, you find a way to make it work." The posts weren't explicitly about me, but anyone who knew about our situation would understand the intended message. I was the family member who didn't understand that we were all in this together. I was the person who wasn't finding a way to make it work when people I loved needed help. Part of me wanted to respond, to share my own version of events, to explain the full context that everyone was missing. But I realized that engaging in social media warfare would only escalate the situation and make me look defensive and petty. Instead, I took more screenshots and continued living my life, letting their narrative exist without my participation or validation. The breaking point came Friday evening when Tyler showed up at my apartment building unannounced. The doorman called to let me know I had a visitor, and I felt my stomach drop when he said my brother was in the lobby asking to come up. I considered telling the doorman I wasn't available, but I knew that avoiding Tyler would only fuel their narrative about my unreasonableness. So I told him to send Tyler up, and I spent the few minutes before he arrived preparing myself for whatever conversation was coming. When I opened the door, Tyler looked uncomfortable and determined in equal measure. He was carrying a manila envelope, which I assumed contained the retirement documents my parents wanted me to sign. "Hi, Jess. I hope you don't mind me stopping by. I was in Denver for a job interview, and Mom thought maybe we could talk in person." A job interview. That was interesting. Tyler was actually looking for better employment opportunities, which suggested that maybe our previous conversation had prompted some reflection about his own contributions to family financial stability. "Come in. How did the interview go?" "Pretty well, I think. It's a marketing position with a sporting goods company. Better pay than what I'm doing now, and full benefits." We sat in my living room, and I could see Tyler taking in the details of my apartment, the nice furniture I had been able to afford once my income exceeded my basic living expenses, the artwork on the walls, the general atmosphere of adult, financial stability that I had built carefully over several years. "Your place looks great," he said, and there was something wistful in his voice that I hadn't expected. "Thanks. It's taken a while to get everything the way I wanted it." Tyler set the manila envelope on my coffee table but didn't immediately reference it. Instead, he seemed to be working up to something, choosing his words carefully. "Jess, I've been thinking about our conversation on Sunday, and I want you to know that I never really understood how different our experiences were growing up. I always thought Mom and Dad treated us fairly, but I'm starting to realize that maybe I didn't see the whole picture." His admission surprised me. I had expected him to pressure me about signing the documents, not to acknowledge disparities in our treatment that he had previously dismissed as irrelevant. "What made you start thinking about it differently?" "A few things. The job interview today made me realize how unprepared I am for adult financial responsibilities compared to other people my age. And after we talked, I started asking Mom and Dad more questions about their financial situation. The more I learned, the more I realized how serious their problems are and how much they've been protecting me from understanding any of it. Tyler's growing awareness was encouraging, but I wondered if it was genuine insight or just another strategy to convince me to help. I decided to test his understanding by asking direct questions about what he had learned. What did you find out about their debt situation? It's worse than they initially told you. They owe closer to $90,000 across credit cards, medical bills, and a home equity loan they took out last year. Dad's retirement income is about half of what they were expecting because some of his investments performed poorly, and Mom's real estate career basically ended when the market shifted. $90,000, even more than they had admitted to me. And the revelation about Dad's retirement income explained why they needed access to additional retirement accounts rather than simply living on their planned retirement funds. Did they explain why they haven't asked you to contribute to household expenses or help with any of these obligations? Tyler looked uncomfortable, fidgeting with the envelope on the coffee table. They said I was still getting established and they didn't want to burden me with stress about money. But after our conversation, I realized that you were getting established too when they refused to help with college costs. And you were younger than I am now. His recognition of the parallel was significant, suggesting that he was genuinely beginning to understand the patterns of differential treatment rather than simply trying to manipulate me into compliance. Tyler, I'm glad you're starting to see these connections, but I'm not sure it changes the fundamental problem with what they're asking me to do. He leaned forward, his expression serious and focused. What if it wasn't just you? What if I found ways to contribute too, so that solving their financial problems became something we were both involved in rather than something they expected you to handle alone? The offer intrigued me, not because I thought Tyler could significantly improve their financial situation, but because it suggested he was finally willing to accept adult responsibility for family problems instead of expecting me to handle everything, while he remained protected from stress and obligation. What kind of contributions are you thinking about? If I get this job, I could pay rent for living at home and help with utilities and groceries. I could also look into whether there are ways to consolidate their debt that don't require family co-signers or early retirement withdrawals. And I could be involved in all the conversations and decisions about their financial planning instead of being kept ignorant while you're expected to solve everything. Tyler's suggestions were reasonable and demonstrated genuine willingness to share responsibility for family financial problems. But they didn't address the immediate issue of the retirement account documents, and I suspected that was intentional. Those are all good ideas, Tyler. But even if you start contributing financially, Mom and Dad still need a co-signer for these retirement account withdrawals, and I'm still not comfortable accepting responsibility for penalties and taxes related to their financial decisions. Tyler nodded slowly, as if he had expected that response. What if we explored alternatives first? What if we made signing those documents the last resort instead of the first solution? What kind of alternatives? Debt consolidation loans that don't require family co-signers, refinancing their mortgage to access equity without early retirement penalties, maybe even selling the house and moving somewhere less expensive so they don't need as much monthly income. The alternatives Tyler suggested were all options that I had researched during my own analysis of their situation. The fact that he had independently identified similar possibilities suggested that he was taking their financial problems seriously and thinking creatively about solutions that didn't automatically default to asking me to assume financial risk. Have you discussed any of these alternatives with Mom and Dad? I tried to, but they seem convinced that accessing the retirement accounts is the simplest solution. They keep saying that everything else would take too long or be too complicated. Tyler's observation confirmed what I had suspected, that my parents wanted the retirement account solution specifically because it transferred financial risk to me, while allowing them to avoid more difficult conversations about lifestyle changes or alternative approaches to debt management. Tyler, I appreciate that you're thinking seriously about this situation and looking for ways to contribute. But I need you to understand that even with your involvement, I'm not comfortable co-signing documents that could make me responsible for tens of thousands of dollars in penalties related to decisions I wasn't involved in making. He was quiet for a moment, and I could see him processing the finality of my position. When he spoke again, his voice carried a note of resignation mixed with understanding. "I get it, Jess. I really do. And I'm sorry it took me so long to understand how unfair all of this has been to you. I think maybe I need to have some different conversations with Mom and Dad about their expectations and my responsibilities." Tyler's acknowledgement felt genuine, and for the first time in our conversation, I believed that he was truly beginning to grasp the bigger picture rather than simply trying to find a way to convince me to sign the documents. But I also knew that his growing awareness wouldn't necessarily change our parents' approach to the situation. If anything, they might become more desperate and more manipulative as they realized that their strategy of using family pressure to change my mind wasn't working. And I suspected that the real test of Tyler's new understanding would come when they asked him to choose between supporting their expectations and supporting my boundaries. The envelope still sat on my coffee table, unopened and unaddressed, containing documents that represented years of family dysfunction disguised as financial planning. Whatever came next, I knew that my answer would remain the same. But I was curious to see whether Tyler's evolving perspective would lead to meaningful changes in how our family approached problems and shared responsibilities. The campaign, to change my mind, was intensifying, but so was my clarity about the boundaries I needed to maintain. And for the first time, it seemed possible that I might not be the only family member questioning whether our traditional patterns of problem-solving were actually working for anyone involved. 2 weeks passed without any contact from my parents, which was unusual enough to make me wonder if they were regrouping for a different approach or finally accepting that I wouldn't change my mind about the retirement documents. Tyler had gotten the marketing job and started paying rent at home, which he mentioned in a brief text that felt more like a progress report than casual conversation. The manila envelope still sat on my kitchen counter, unopened and gradually becoming a symbol of boundaries I was learning to maintain. The silence broke on a Thursday morning when Mom called while I was getting ready for work. Her voice sounded different, less manipulative and more genuinely distressed than it had been during our previous conversations. "Jessica, I need to talk to you about something that's happened. Your father had a mild heart attack yesterday evening." The words hit me like cold water, and I felt my carefully maintained emotional distance waver for the first time in weeks. Despite everything that had happened between us, the thought of Dad being seriously ill triggered immediate concern and guilt about whether my refusal to help with their financial stress had contributed to his medical crisis. "Is he okay? What hospital is he at?" "He's stable now, at Scottsdale Healthcare. The doctors say it was relatively minor, but they want to keep him for observation and run some additional tests. The thing is, Jessica, we're discovering that our health insurance situation is more complicated than we realized. Even in the midst of a medical emergency, Mom was presenting information in carefully constructed ways that obscured the full truth while positioning me as the solution to problems I hadn't created. I felt my sympathy for Dad's health crisis beginning to compete with frustration about the familiar patterns of selective disclosure and implied responsibility. "What do you mean the insurance situation is complicated?" "Well, when your father took early retirement, we had to transition to private insurance, and the coverage isn't as comprehensive as what he had through his employer. There are going to be significant out-of-pocket costs for the hospital stay and the cardiac procedures they're recommending." Private insurance with inadequate coverage. Another financial obligation that they hadn't mentioned during our previous conversations about their debt situation. Another variable that changed the calculation of what they owed and why they needed access to retirement funds. "Mom, how much are we talking about in terms of medical costs?" "The doctors think it could be anywhere from $20,000 to $40,000, depending on what additional treatments Dad needs. Our insurance will cover some of it, but the deductibles and copays are substantial. $20,000 to $40,000 on top of the $90,000 in existing debt that Tyler had discovered. Their financial crisis was even more severe than anyone had acknowledged. and Dad's health problems were adding urgency and complexity that made simple solutions even more difficult to identify. Have you talked to the hospital about payment plans or financial assistance programs? We're looking into that, but Jessica, this situation makes accessing the retirement funds even more critical. We need those resources to cover Dad's medical care and get our financial situation stabilized. There it was, the medical emergency being used to justify the same retirement account withdrawals that I had already refused to co-sign. Mom was using Dad's heart attack to create emotional urgency around financial decisions that remained fundamentally unchanged, hoping that concern about his health would override my objections to assuming responsibility for penalties and taxes. Mom, I'm very concerned about Dad's health, and I want him to get the medical care he needs. But his heart attack doesn't change the fact that co-signing early retirement withdrawals would make me financially responsible for substantial penalties and taxes. If anything, adding medical expenses to your existing debt makes it even more important to explore alternatives that don't involve additional financial penalties. The silence on the other end of the line was heavy with disappointment and frustration. When Mom spoke again, her voice carried an edge of accusation that I hadn't heard before. Jessica, your father is in the hospital with heart problems, and you're worried about financial penalties. This is about family priorities and what matters most when people you love are facing serious challenges. The guilt trip was more sophisticated this time, positioning my concern about financial risk as callousness about Dad's health, my refusal to sign documents as abandonment during a medical crisis. But I had learned to recognize these manipulation tactics, and I understood that genuine concern about Dad's well-being didn't require accepting financial responsibility for problems that predated his heart attack. Mom, I'm going to drive down to Phoenix this weekend to visit Dad and see how he's doing. But I want you to understand that my concern about his health is separate from my position about the retirement account documents. I won't co-sign withdrawals that could cost me tens of thousands of dollars regardless of what medical expenses you're facing. So you'll come visit, but you won't help with the one thing that could actually solve our problems. I'll come visit because I care about Dad's health and recovery. I won't co-sign financial documents because I care about my own financial security and refuse to perpetuate patterns of unfair treatment that have harmed our family relationships. After we hung up, I sat in my car for several minutes before driving to work, processing the complicated emotions that Dad's heart attack had triggered. I was genuinely worried about his health and wanted to support his recovery in any way I could. But I was also aware that Mom was using his medical crisis to intensify pressure around financial decisions that had nothing to do with his immediate medical needs. The drive to Phoenix that Saturday gave me time to think about how I wanted to handle the visit. I wanted to see Dad and express my concern about his health without getting drawn into conversations about retirement account co-signing. I wanted to support his recovery without accepting responsibility for financial problems that his heart attack had complicated but not created. Dad was sitting up in his hospital bed when I arrived, looking pale but alert, with monitoring equipment attached to his chest and an IV line in his arm. Mom was in the bedside chair, and Tyler was standing near the window, all of them turning toward me with expressions that were difficult to read. "Hi, Dad. How are you feeling?" "Better than yesterday, sweetheart. The doctors say the damage was minimal, and I should make a full recovery with some lifestyle changes and medication." I hugged him carefully, mindful of the monitoring wires, and felt the familiar mixture of love and frustration that had characterized our relationship for years. Despite everything that had happened between us, he was still my father, and seeing him in a hospital bed reminded me of how much I cared about his well-being. "I'm so glad it wasn't more serious. Were you having symptoms beforehand, or did it come on suddenly?" "I'd been having some chest pressure for a few weeks, but I thought it was just stress about the financial situation. The doctor says that chronic stress can definitely contribute to cardiac problems." The comment about financial stress was clearly intended to remind me that my refusal to help was contributing to the health problems that had led to his hospitalization. But I had learned not to accept responsibility for other people's stress, about problems they had created, even when that stress had medical consequences. I'm sure the financial pressure has been difficult. Have you been able to talk to the doctors about lifestyle changes that might help with stress management? We talked for a while about his medical care and recovery plan, avoiding the topic of retirement accounts and cosigners while focusing on his immediate health needs. But I could feel the unspoken tension in the room, the awareness that we were all carefully navigating around the conflict that had brought us to this point. Tyler seemed different during the visit, more subdued and thoughtful than usual, watching the interactions between me and our parents with an expression that suggested he was processing things he hadn't understood before. When Mom stepped out to talk to nurses about discharge planning, he moved closer to Dad's bed and asked a question that surprised both of us. "Dad, do you think the stress about money really contributed to your heart attack?" Dad looked uncomfortable with the direct question, glancing toward the door as if hoping Mom would return to rescue him from the conversation. "Well, financial pressure is stressful, and the doctors say that chronic stress can affect heart health. I've been worried about how we're going to manage everything." Tyler nodded slowly, then asked another question that seemed to catch Dad off guard. "Do you think it would be less stressful to explore other solutions that don't require Jessica to take on financial risk? Like selling the house or downsizing so you need less income to cover expenses?" I watched Dad's face change as he processed Tyler's suggestion, saw him realize that his younger son was no longer automatically supporting the retirement account solution that had seemed like the obvious approach just weeks earlier. "Tyler, selling the house would be complicated and time-consuming, and we'd probably lose money in the current market. Accessing the retirement accounts is much more straightforward." "But straightforward for who, Dad?" "It's straightforward for you and Mom because Jessica assumes the financial risk. It's not straightforward for Jessica, who could end up owing tens of thousands of dollars in penalties for withdrawals she didn't request to solve problems she didn't create." Tyler's analysis was clear and direct, demonstrating that he had genuinely begun to understand the fundamental unfairness of what our parents were requesting. Dad looked surprised and slightly betrayed, as if Tyler's growing awareness represented some kind of disloyalty to family solidarity. "Tyler, I thought you understood that family members help each other during difficult times. Jessica has the financial stability to handle the cosigner requirements, and we've always been there for both of you when you needed support." "Have you always been there for both of us equally, Dad?" The question hung in the air like a challenge, and I realized that Tyler had moved beyond simply understanding the current situation to questioning the broader patterns of family support and resource allocation that had shaped our relationships for years. Dad's response was defensive and uncomfortable. "We've always done our best for both of you, though different children need different kinds of support at different times. Jessica needed support when she was 18 and applying for colleges. She got independence lessons instead. I needed support when I was 25 and living at home without career direction. I got protection from financial stress and family problems. Now you need support with financial problems, and you're asking Jessica to provide it while continuing to protect me from the consequences of those problems." Tyler's summary of family dynamics was more articulate and insightful than anything I had expected from him. He had clearly been thinking seriously about the patterns of differential treatment and was no longer willing to passively benefit from arrangements that exploited me while protecting him. Dad looked stricken, as if Tyler's questions were forcing him to confront uncomfortable truths about family fairness that he had been avoiding for years. "Tyler, we never intended for anyone to feel treated unfairly. We made the best decisions we could with the information and resources we had at the time. Dad, intentions matter, but impact matters more. The impact of your decisions was that Jessica learned to be financially independent because she had to be, while I learned to be financially dependent because I was allowed to be. Now you're asking her to use the independence she was forced to develop to solve problems while continuing to protect me from developing similar independence." Tyler's insight was remarkable. but I could see that it was also painful for Dad to hear his parenting decisions analyzed so directly. When Mom returned to the room, the tension was immediately apparent, and she looked between the three of us with the expression of someone walking into the middle of a difficult conversation. "Is everything okay? You all look very serious." Tyler answered before Dad or I could respond. "We were talking about family dynamics and whether the retirement account solution is really the best approach for everyone involved." Mom's face tightened, and I could see her recognizing that Tyler was no longer an automatic ally in their campaign to convince me to co-sign the documents. "Tyler, I hope you're not letting your sister convince you to abandon your parents when we need help most." "I'm not abandoning anyone, Mom. I'm trying to understand why solving family financial problems always seems to become Jessica's responsibility while I'm protected from even knowing those problems exist." The conversation continued for another hour, with Tyler asking increasingly direct questions about family financial history and decision-making patterns. By the time visiting hours ended, it was clear that he had fundamentally shifted his perspective on both the current situation and the broader family dynamics that had created it. As we walked to the parking lot together, Tyler seemed exhausted, but also somehow lighter, as if acknowledging difficult truths had relieved him of burdens he hadn't realized he was carrying. "Jess, I owe you an apology. Not just for this situation, but for years of benefiting from unfair treatment without questioning it or standing up for you." "Tyler, you don't need to apologize for being the favored child. You didn't create those dynamics, and you were just responding to the incentives and protections our parents provided. Maybe I didn't create them, but I definitely perpetuated them by accepting benefits while remaining ignorant about costs. And I could have questioned things sooner if I had been paying attention." We talked for a while longer in the parking lot, and Tyler shared insights about family patterns that he was just beginning to recognize. He had started to understand that our parents' financial crisis wasn't really about retirement account access. It was about avoiding difficult conversations about lifestyle changes and personal responsibility that would require them to acknowledge the consequences of their financial decisions. "What are you going to do about the cosigner documents?" Tyler asked. "I'm not going to sign them. Dad's heart attack doesn't change the fundamental problems with what they're asking me to do. If anything, it makes it more important for them to find sustainable solutions that don't create additional financial risk for family members." Tyler nodded slowly. "What if I told them I want to be involved in exploring alternatives? Not just paying rent, but actually participating in discussions about debt consolidation, downsizing, lifestyle changes, all the options that don't require you to assume financial risk. I think that would be helpful, but I also think you should be prepared for them to resist your involvement. They've spent years protecting you from family financial realities, and they might not be ready to include you in difficult conversations about money and lifestyle changes." Tyler's prediction about their resistance proved accurate. Over the following weeks, as Dad recovered from his heart attack and returned home, Tyler tried repeatedly to initiate conversations about alternative solutions to their financial crisis. Each time, our parents deflected his suggestions and redirected conversations back to the retirement account withdrawals that required my co-signature. They seemed genuinely unable to consider alternatives that would require them to make significant lifestyle changes or acknowledge the full scope of their financial mismanagement. The retirement account solution allowed them to access money without selling their house, without dramatically reducing expenses, without having difficult conversations about the gap between their financial resources and their financial expectations. The pressure campaign continued, but with diminishing intensity as it became clear that Tyler was no longer supporting their approach, and I remained unmoved by guilt trips about Dad's health crisis. Extended family members began to receive more complete information about the situation, and several of them started questioning whether early retirement withdrawals were really the best solution for substantial debt problems. Mom's Facebook posts became more frequent and more pointed, with thinly veiled references to children who abandon parents during health crises and financial difficulties. But the posts also began attracting comments from people who questioned, Whether adult children should be expected to assume financial responsibility for parents' retirement planning mistakes. The turning point came 6 weeks after Dad's heart attack, when Tyler called to tell me that our parents had finally agreed to meet with a debt counselor to explore alternatives to early retirement withdrawals. The counselor had recommended a combination of downsizing, debt consolidation, and lifestyle changes that would address their financial problems without requiring family co-signers or early retirement penalties. "They're not happy about it," Tyler said, "but they're finally accepting that the retirement account solution isn't going to work because you're not going to sign the documents." "How are they handling the downsizing conversation?" "Not well. They're looking at smaller houses and apartments, and Mom keeps saying that she never thought she'd have to move out of the house where she raised her children. But they're starting to understand that staying in a house they can't afford isn't realistic." Tyler's involvement in family financial discussions had transformed his understanding of money management and personal responsibility in ways that surprised everyone, including himself. He had taken a second part-time job to increase his contribution to household expenses, and he was exploring certification programs that would improve his long-term earning potential. "Tyler, I'm proud of how you've stepped up during this crisis. You've shown more maturity and insight in the last 2 months than I've seen from you in years." "Thanks, Jess. I think I needed to understand what real family responsibility looks like instead of just accepting protection from difficult situations. And I needed to understand that helping family doesn't always mean giving people what they want. Sometimes it means insisting that they find sustainable solutions to their problems." The house sold within 3 months, for less than our parents had hoped, but enough to significantly reduce their debt burden. They moved into a smaller apartment in a less expensive neighborhood, and Dad took a part-time consulting job to supplement their retirement income. Mom returned to real estate part-time, focusing on rental properties rather than high-end home sales. The lifestyle changes were difficult for them, but they were also manageable in ways that early retirement withdrawals with substantial penalties would never have been. Tyler's financial contributions helped stabilize their monthly budget, and his involvement in family financial planning gave him insights about money management that he had never developed while being protected from financial stress. I visited them in their new apartment 6 months after Dad's heart attack, and the dynamic between us felt different, less charged with unspoken resentment and unacknowledged inequality. They seemed to have accepted that I wouldn't assume financial responsibility for problems I hadn't created, and I had demonstrated that setting boundaries didn't mean abandoning family members who needed support. Dad looked healthier and less stressed than he had in years. The smaller apartment required less maintenance and lower monthly expenses, and the part-time consulting work gave him purpose without the pressure of full-time employment. Mom had developed new social connections through her rental property work and seemed to be adjusting to their changed circumstances. "How are you both feeling about the new living situation?" I asked during dinner. "It's an adjustment," Mom admitted. "But it's also simpler in some ways. We don't have to worry about major home repairs or yard maintenance, and our monthly expenses are much more manageable." Dad nodded in agreement. I was resistant to downsizing at first, but I have to admit that the reduced financial pressure has been good for my stress levels and probably for my heart health too. Tyler had moved into his own apartment, a small one-bedroom place near his new full-time marketing job. He was taking evening classes in digital marketing and seemed genuinely excited about building career skills that would support long-term financial independence. "I never realized how much energy it takes to worry about money all the time," he told me during a separate conversation. "I understand now why you worked so hard to become financially stable and why you were unwilling to risk that stability to solve other people's problems." The manila envelope with the retirement account documents still sat in my kitchen drawer, unopened and irrelevant now that our parents had found sustainable solutions to their financial crisis. I kept it as a reminder of the boundaries I had learned to maintain and the importance of refusing to perpetuate harmful family patterns, even when maintaining those boundaries required withstanding significant pressure and guilt. My relationship with my parents had evolved into something more honest and equitable. We talked regularly, but the conversations were no longer characterized by implicit expectations that I would solve their problems while remaining grateful for their selective support. They had learned that I wouldn't automatically assume responsibility for consequences of their decisions, and I had learned that setting boundaries could actually improve family relationships by forcing everyone to develop more sustainable and fair approaches to mutual support. Tyler and I had grown closer than we had ever been as adults, bonded by shared understanding of family dynamics that had taken us years to recognize and address. He had learned to take responsibility for his own financial security and family contributions, and I had learned that supporting family members didn't require accepting unfair treatment or sacrificing my own well-being. The experience had taught me that love and loyalty don't require self-sacrifice, that genuine family support should be reciprocal and sustainable, and that saying no to unreasonable requests can actually strengthen relationships by forcing everyone involved to develop healthier patterns of interaction and mutual respect. I still carried student loan debt from the college education my parents couldn't afford to support, but I no longer carried resentment about their choices or guilt about my success. I had learned to build the life I wanted using the independence they had insisted I develop, and I had learned to protect that life from people who wanted to benefit from my stability without acknowledging the work it had required to achieve it. The story wasn't really about retirement accounts or college funding or family financial planning. It was about learning to recognize patterns of unfair treatment and developing the courage to refuse to perpetuate them, even when that refusal required withstanding pressure from people whose approval had once seemed essential to my sense of family belonging. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do for family is refuse to enable their avoidance of difficult but necessary changes. Sometimes protecting your own well-being is the first step toward building relationships based on genuine mutual respect rather than convenient exploitation. And sometimes the children who are taught independence early learn to use that independence to create boundaries that benefit everyone, even when those boundaries feel like rejection to people who have grown comfortable with inequitable arrangements. I learned that I could love my parents without accepting their financial decisions as my responsibility, support their well-being without sacrificing my own security, and maintain family relationships without perpetuating patterns that had been harmful to everyone involved. The retirement account crisis had forced conversations that were years overdue and created opportunities for growth that none of us had anticipated when the manila envelope first arrived in my email. In the end, the best solution for everyone was the one that required each family member to take appropriate responsibility for their own financial security while contributing equitably to family support when it was needed. It was the solution that taught Tyler about adult financial responsibility, forced my parents to acknowledge the consequences of their financial choices, and allowed me to maintain relationships based on mutual respect rather than one-sided obligation. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.